episode of Bad Takes in Football. I am your host, Bad Takes. Happy to be here. Going to be discussing second-year players that I need to see out there, whether it's something to prove or their team needs them. I'm also going to get into the stories around Jon Gruden, what's going on with him in the NFL. Really excited to get into that and much more. Again, on our way to 100 subscribers. Any like, comment, subscription will really help me. It's easy to do. Please just follow the subscription button below and we'll get started shortly. All right, like I said, let's go ahead and dive into some players that I think either one have something to prove, needing to improve going into next year. Generally, these are players that I see need to have a big impact on their team and would love to be able to see that starting to happen in the preseason. I have a list of generally quarterbacks as well as wide receivers that we'll be going through, so I'll get started with that. So first name on my list, and a player that I'm really curious to see more from, and I think really a lot of Minnesota Vikings fans would want to see more from, is second-year quarterback JJ McCarthy. JJ McCarthy was drafted last year for the Vikings, and by all senses was really expected to either play behind Sam Darnold to begin with, or after really the preseason that he had prior to his injury, was going to be the starter for the Minnesota Vikings. Now, to get into this a little bit more, a couple reasons why I think this is interesting and why I want to see more out of him in the preseason. Going back to last year, right, if you want to talk about JJ McCarthy's debut, he had 206 total yards, two touchdowns, and one interception, right? So again, 206 total yards, two touchdowns, one interception. He had a 116.8 quarterback rating. I remember watching him in those first couple preseason games before his injury, and he was electric. I think he actually, JJ McCarthy by far outplayed what I was expecting from him in his first couple preseason games last year. At Michigan, he was a great quarterback, right? He barely lost. I think he lost a total of 2, maybe 3 games in his career at Michigan. But something that is important to mention when it comes to JJ McCarthy and his time at Michigan was they were really a run-first offense. Not only that, they were also amazing at the defensive side of things, right? Their defense was really good. They were a run-first team, and they had an amazing offensive line. I think JJ McCarthy's senior year, his offensive line won Offensive Line of the Year in all of college sports, right? As an entire unit, they won that. And so that says a lot about the protection that JJ McCarthy had, as well as really, the run game that they had and how they're able to depend on that run game mostly. Now, we're obviously going off of very little from an NFL career, but again, like I said, he did have a really good preseason last year, all right? 206 total yards. There hasn't been a guy this year in the first week of the preseason, I think, that has gotten that from a quarterback perspective. I think the two players that were probably closest would probably be Shedeur Sanders as well as Jackson Dart. Jackson Dart had a great first game as well. But JJ McCarthy really needs to step it up this year because there isn't a backup plan right now, right? There isn't a Sam Darnold sitting there waiting to either start or be his backup that is a ready plug-and-play quarterback. And so the Minnesota Vikings are really depending on JJ McCarthy. So much so that they drafted him 10th overall last year, right? That's not like it's a Shedeur Sanders in the 5th round. Okay, they really invested in JJ McCarthy, and so this is his time to shine. I'm going to go over his first game stats and take this with a grain of salt because there's a huge difference between this year and last year and the expectations and also how much he played. I think that's a big part of this. Again, JJ McCarthy, in the preseason, he had a total of 30 yards and no touchdowns and also no interceptions, right? So right off the bat, you're not excited about those numbers, right? That's not something where people are talking about him after that game, right? It's an afterthought. Most people, were paying attention to the Jackson Darts and Shador Sanders performances in the preseason, right? Amongst the other players that I talked about in my previous episode earlier this week. And diving into this, just to talk a little bit more about why I need to really see JJ McCarthy more, I wanted to talk a little bit about his college career and really the numbers that he had and why it's important for him to really prove himself, as the franchise quarterback for the Vikings. Again, he played 3 seasons with the Michigan Wolverines, and I would say his senior year was his best year. He had a 72.3% completion percentage. That alone is something to get excited about. Generally, you're happy with anything above 65%. And so 72% is outstanding, and that's a number that probably got the Vikings really excited. He had 2,991 yards passing his senior year, right? So not even 3,000 yards, which I think to me is like a benchmark for someone that is, I would say, a pass first team. You're going to see over 3,000 yards for these quarterbacks that are generally in a pass heavy offense. And so that gives you a little bit of insight into how much they really pass the ball at Michigan. And I think that's an important factor. He had 22 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. So that's a pretty good number right there. I would be happy with that from any sort of scouting or pro team perspective when looking at those numbers. You want someone that's going to be able to take care of the ball as well as score. And he did a pretty good job of that. And to really rally things up, he had 202 rushing yards for 3 touchdowns his senior year as well. And so again, pretty solid numbers, right? He was efficient. I think that's the word I would use to describe JJ McCarthy is efficient, right? He's not a gunslinger by any means. He's been able to throw the rock around a fair amount. One of his greatest highlights in the preseason last season was a pretty long throw. I think it was probably a 65-yard plus touchdown that he had. But again, that's generally been few and far between, especially in his college career, and that's really what we have to work from. And so again, that's a big reason why I want to see JJ McCarthy in the preseason. And I'll caveat this really quickly because I think this is also important to mention. But JJ McCarthy did get injured last year. He tore his meniscus and had to get season-ending surgery. Right? When you get season-ending surgery, generally after you're invested as much as you are as like a first round pick and the first pick for the Vikings in this draft, you're going to be a little bit more conservative with them. You're going to be a little bit more hesitant to put them out there because, again, there isn't a backup plan. There isn't a fall net for JJ McCarthy this year. They need him to be out there, and they need JJ McCarthy to be productive. And so maybe that's a big reason why we didn't see a lot of him in this preseason game, right? They want to make sure that he probably, I would say he probably was in 1 series, right? Maybe 2, but at the same time, 30 yards isn't necessarily a lot of production. You're going to want to see more out of him. And so really, for me, when I'm looking at the next preseason game, the Vikings have the Patriots, right? So we're actually going to be able to see a matchup between 2 second-year quarterbacks, between JJ McCarthy and Drake May. Drake May was drafted actually before JJ McCarthy, so I'll be really curious to see what that matchup looks like. And I would say JJ McCarthy played less in the preseason than Drake May did this past game. So for me, again, this is a great opportunity for the Vikings fans, for the organization, for us to really make sure and see, like, hey, are we confident in JJ McCarthy going into week 1 of the regular season? That's really what these preseason games are there for. It's a way to knock the cobwebs off, get into live football time, live football play, right? That's a completely different world than what you see in training camp, right? These quarterbacks in training camp aren't being touched, right? They have this little, I would call it a false sense of confidence because of the fact that they know they're not going to be hit, they're generally willing to do more and try more. And so for me, getting some preseason time is going to be crucial for JJ McCarthy. On top of that, you also have to think you're generally willing to try different things and take riskier shots in practice. And so in a live game, in a preseason game, I think it's going to be important for JJ McCarthy to get those real live reps in and do what you would actually probably be doing in a game. You know, some other important aspects I think that are important to mention when it comes to JJ McCarthy and why I think it's important to play. Um, One, again, he's coming off of a year where Sam Darnold had a comeback year, right? Sam Darnold won 14 games for the Vikings. And so because of that, a lot of people are just crediting Kevin O'Connell. They're saying the reason why Sam Darnold was successful is because they had Kevin O'Connell out there or as at head coach. And so if JJ McCarthy can just essentially be a game manager, I think a lot of times that's what they're thinking and just hoping for from a JJ McCarthy perspective. So I'm looking at this comment from Ashton. If McCarthy didn't light it up, he'll be the exception, not the rule under O'Connell. Remember, Josh Dobbs and Nick Mullins looked halfway decent quarterbacks. And yeah, I would agree with that. And that's kind of what I was getting to right there is, again, are people going to put this, put success that JJ McCarthy has on JJ McCarthy? Are they going to say, hey, he did this? Or are they going to say, this was Kevin O'Connell and this is a system quarterback and it happened to work well when it comes to when it comes to these quarterbacks, right? Again, Sam Darnold, I would consider him a journeyman now, right? He's already in Seattle. He had a great year last year in Minnesota, and he's already on a different team. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact they invested a first-round pick in JJ McCarthy. But again, a lot of people put that success Sam Darnold had on Kevin McCarthy. Another quarterback that I want to see more out of this year, especially in the preseason, is Bo Nix. Now, a lot of the pundits, a lot of the media, in my opinion, are already trying to crown Bo Nix as one of the best to come out of that draft class. Now, this was a really heavy quarterback draft class, right? You have Caleb Williams, you have Jaden Daniels, you have JJ McCarthy, Michael Penix, Bo Nix, right? There's a lot of quarterbacks that came out of that 2024 draft. Bo Nix was drafted 12th overall from Denver. I think a lot of people were kind of shocked by this, but to me, it made a lot of sense. Bo Nix, he reminds me a lot of Drew Brees from a demeanor perspective, especially. When you talk to Bo Nix, when you see him, in interviews, in press conferences, off the field totally, he seems like a great guy. He seems like a true leader, and he seems like an infectious personality that a lot of people love to see out there, right? And Bo Nix had a great year last year as well. I think that's also important to remember. And from a regular season perspective, and I am saying regular season because he did make the playoffs. He had 3,700 yards last year, a little over 3,700 yards, 29 touchdowns, and 12 interceptions. Right, that's a great rookie season. I think a lot of people don't understand how good of a rookie season that is. A lot of times people like to look at people like Peyton Manning, right? And they think he was amazing his entire career. Peyton Manning had a really rough, rookie season. I think a lot of people forget the fact that Peyton Manning, his rookie season, he had 28 interceptions and 26 touchdowns. So he had more interceptions than touchdowns, and it was 28 of them. So he almost had as many interceptions as Bo Nix had touchdowns in his rookie season. So that's like a huge benchmark I think people forget when it comes to Bo Nix. Now, Bo Nix was almost identical to JJ McCarthy in their preseason debuts. I don't think either of them played a lot in the preseason, which is understandable from a Bo Nix perspective, more so than a JJ McCarthy perspective, in my opinion. Bo Nix, I think, again, is a little bit more proven already, even though it's been 1 year. Again, he made the playoffs, which was super impressive to see. Um, and so when it comes to Bo Nix, the reason why I need to see more out of him is because of these expectations that are coming out, right? He showed a lot of ability to stand in the pocket. He was taking hits and throws, on throws. Um, I thought he did a really good job of reading defenses, and he did a great job of using his legs last year. He had almost 500 yards rushing as well. And so for me, the biggest aspect is taking that next step when you are a successful quarterback your rookie year. A lot of people are talking about, you know, the performance that, wow, his name is escaping my mind. Texans quarterback, right? I think a lot of people forget CJ Stroud. He had an outstanding rookie season, and his numbers dropped off a little bit last year, right? And so I think that's like a big part of this is it's really easy to be successful when not a lot of people have tape on you, right? When people don't really see how you operate, what your tendencies are, what you would like to do, what you try to avoid, generally you're going to be more successful than someone that has a full year of tape on them. And Bo Nix now has that, right? And so for me, you need to see Bo Nix out there more in order to continue. Wow, easy for me to say. You need to see Bo Nix out there to continue to see him to progress, because what you don't want is to have another situation like CJ Stroud had. And I'm not saying CJ Stroud had a terrible year last year, but the numbers are pretty, I would say, polarizing in the sense where he had 4,100 yards his rookie season. He had 3,700 yards his second year. He went from 23 touchdowns to 20, and then he went from 5 interceptions to 12 interceptions. Right? That's a pretty big drop off. Like, I would say he regressed in that sense. And to that point, not many people are talking about a CJ Stroud anymore, but there's a lot of people talking about Bo Nix right now. There's a lot of people that are putting Bo Nix and the Broncos as, sometimes I've even heard, Super Bowl contenders, but definitely contenders for the AFC West. There are people out there that are predicting Bo Nix and the Broncos to win the AFC West. And to me, if that's the expectations you have, if that's your goal, you need to progress, and you need to get as many live reps and as much practice as you possibly can while you're out there. And that's a really good point, Ashton. Yeah, the Broncos were, and I think still are, paying Russell Wilson, $53 million not to play. And so Bo Nix also didn't have that sort of cap space to work to get weapons around him to be productive last year. I think Cortland Sutton was a great weapon for him last year, and I think from I wow, it's easy for me to talk today. The Broncos paid Cortland Sutton for his production last year, but I think they're obviously, they need to make another step, and that he's going to be vital for Bo Nix's success, and hopefully they're able to add even more around him, as the years go by, so that it's not just Cortland Sutton that's really saving the day for him. But that is a really good point. He did have a tough situation that he walked into. I don't think a lot of people thought the Broncos were going to be as good as they were last year. Now they have those expectations, and so it's going to be important for Bo Nix to really prove himself this year. Now, when it comes to, I'll go over one more quarterback, even though to me there's really another one that I can talk about a little bit, and maybe I'll get into it just a little bit, but I don't want to piss off Bears fans too much on this episode, if I'm being completely honest. But Michael Penix, right? Michael Penix is another guy that I find to be really interesting when it comes to second-year quarterbacks for a couple different reasons. And again, before I go into this, just know, like, Michael Penix didn't play in the week 1 of the preseason, right? And so there's could be a couple reasons for that. From my perspective, the reason why I don't think Michael Penix played is I'm hearing a lot of confidence coming out of Atlanta right now. I am hearing a lot of media members, I'm hearing from players that the Falcons are the real deal this year, and Michael Penix is really commanding that team, and he's looking great out there, throwing the ball down the field, commanding the offense, getting Kyle Pitts involved. Michael Penix has made a real point to talk about the fact that he's going to get he's going to get Kyle Pitts involved in this offense early and often. He plans on using Kyle Pitts a lot out there. I think every Falcons fan is probably excited to hear that, maybe a little bit nervous because I know year after year everyone's expecting Kyle Pitts to be what they expected him to be when they drafted him. But Michael Penix seems to be the guy that's saying he's going to get him involved. And so for me, again, this is a guy that I need to see out there. There are a couple things when it comes to Michael Penix. So one, last year, first off, he didn't play a lot of the season. He played out of necessity, and that a lot of that had to do with the fact that Kirk Cousins, didn't have the season that he was looking to have coming off of an Achilles injury. I think between age, having to come off that Achilles injury and being in a completely different system, it was really tough for Kirk Cousins to be productive and be the player that he was trying to be out there. But Michael Penix, he played in 5 games. He had 58% completion percentage. Again, not exactly what you're looking for, and he had 775 yards, 3 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. For me, that does not condone or allow you to sit out in a preseason game. Maybe I'm a little bit old school when it comes to preseason, but for me, you haven't earned the right to not play in preseason with numbers like that. And again, I'm saying this now like there's a lot of confidence coming out of Atlanta, but for me, I don't care who you are. If you're a second-year player, you're on a rookie contract, you should be out there playing and getting live reps. It's not like he had a full season of work that he is able to work off of coming into this year, right? He still didn't play it in a lot of games, right? Less than half. And so for me, he has something to prove. And I'm expecting Michael Penix to go out there and play a little bit, right? Because the other aspect of this, and maybe this is why, he didn't necessarily play in this preseason game, a lot of it might have to do with the fact that, he is pretty injury prone, right? He had 2 major injuries while he was at the University of Indiana, one of them being an ACL. And at Washington, going into that championship game, he was beaten up. He was battered. He looked rough out there. And he's not exactly the youngest quarterback coming out of college. He's 25 years old. We've talked about this. Like, that's the same age as, like, Tyler Shuck as a rookie. Trey Lance is 25 years old, who's been in the league for a couple years already. So it's not like he's super young. But for me, he still has something to prove. And I get that you might want to hold him out because of injuries. And, injuries are a great way to ruin a season. But he still has to get connected with this offense. He still needs to be able to get those live reps in my opinion, for Michael Penix to be effective this year. If he doesn't play a lot in the preseason game 2 or game 3, I'm gonna project the Falcons to start out a little bit slow this year. Again, they have talent. I like his receivers. I'm a huge fan of Drake London. Bijan Robinson is a great running back. I know a lot of people are expecting him to be the top running back this year. But again, Michael Penix still needs to produce himself in order to be successful. And this is also in the fact that he's in the NFC South, which is a pretty easy division this year, right? I think everyone's really projecting the Saints to be in last place. I think they have, from a Vegas odds perspective, they have the odds to have the least amount of wins this year. The Panthers are still trying to figure out, in my opinion, if Bryce Young is the guy. I think they had a solid end to the season last season, but they still haven't proven by any means that they should be the top team in the NFC South. Really, the team they have to compete with the most is the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers last year surprised a lot of people with Baker Mayfield's play. I think Baker Mayfield really was a game changer, was a team changer for the Bucs. Instead of just having a quarterback that got them to the next quarterback, they ended up finding the guy that was going to be their player. So for me, the Falcons have a really good opportunity. I don't want to see them get off to a slow start. I do want to see Michael Penix out there. Now, I talked about this one quarterback a little bit, but I'll kind of put this quarterback in here just purely because to me it didn't really make a lot of sense that he wasn't out there. And I'm not going to go too far in this one, but Caleb Williams. Caleb Williams, everything out of camp, and maybe this is just smoke, right? Maybe there's not actually fire where they're actually talking about this, but everyone's talking about the relationship between Ben Johnson, his style of offense, and Caleb Williams, and how Caleb Williams is struggling with it a little bit. Caleb Williams, first off, before I get into this any further, I think Caleb Williams is a good quarterback. I think has the opportunity to be a great quarterback. I think there's a lot of challenges that he faced last year that weren't necessarily his fault. He was sacked 68 times last year, which that's a lot of pressure, right, as a quarterback. The other side of this, and something I'll say, and GMs, executives, scouts talked about this. He did hold on to the ball too long, so that's a huge reason why he was sacked a lot. But he still had 3,500 yards, 20 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions. So that's a good rookie season. I think anyone would be happy with that. Now again, this is a new offense. He has a new coach, new system. Caleb Williams needs those reps as well. A lot of what Ben Johnson does, to me, it's not necessarily what Caleb Williams does best. Caleb Williams to me is a playmaker. And what I mean by that is he will make something out of nothing. But Ben Johnson's system is all about creating those opportunities and passing the ball accurately and on time. That's a big aspect of Ben Johnson's offense. Jared Goff did a great job running that. Caleb Williams, that's going to be a little bit of an adjustment for him. It's going to be a lot based off of timing and having that relationship with your wide receivers. And for me, you need preseason reps. You need live reps in order to just really see how this is going to work and getting comfortable in it. So that's my addition to this. Is Caleb Williams I expect to see out there more. I truly didn't understand why he wasn't out there in the first preseason game. I think everyone was expecting to see Caleb Williams out there. And we'll talk about one of his wide receivers in a little bit as well. But again, those are the quarterbacks that I need to see more of in the preseason. Again, I think a little of this has to do with the fact that we're in an era where more often than not, players and teams are more hesitant to put their key guys, their star players out there because of injuries and how that can impact a team. We've already seen some main players go out for teams, like Rashawn Slater, who's a tackle for the Chargers. Landon Dickerson, who it could have been a lot worse. He had a meniscus injury, but he's out currently for the Eagles. That's a key player for the Eagles. Wasn't in a preseason game. Neither of those injuries were in a preseason game, but still, you do want to protect these players as much as possible. And so maybe that's a big reason why we don't see a lot of them out there. Yeah, I agree with you, Will. He hasn't really proven anything, but yeah, at the same time, they did invest a lot in him. I think, and to be honest, I don't think a lot of people saw that coming, how much they invested in him, and the fact that they used that draft pick to get a quarterback after spending so much money on Kirk Cousins. But we're going to go ahead and get into the receivers. Before I do that, again, please make sure you subscribe to this channel. You can see that goal counter in the bottom left. On our way to 100, my first 100 subscribers. All of this would be appreciated. It's super helpful to me to get my content out there so that more people can find it. Make sure you're subscribing. Make sure you like. Make sure you comment. Tell me any of your takes. Tell me some topics you might want me to talk about. But again, that it would be super helpful if you were to do that. Now, getting into second-year receivers that I need to see more from. We'll start out with the main receiver that was taken last year, right? Marvin Harrison Jr. So Marvin Harrison first thing I'll mention when it comes to him is, and the biggest talks around Marvin Harrison is the fact that he's really, really changed his body. That guy has put on some weight, and he's put on some weight in a good way, right? I'm not just saying he's gotten chubby. We're not talking about, Eddie Lacy here. That was a great reference. I'm glad I thought of that right off the bat. But yeah, he's not. This isn't an Eddie Lacy issue. He bulked up in a good way. Like his shoulders, his arms, his whole body just looks like he's been in the gym this entire offseason. He's 6'3", 220 pounds right now. I don't know what he was listed at last year, but I would bet that he's gained a solid 15 pounds at least in this offseason, and that's a good 15 pounds. Now, he did play in the preseason game. He had one catch for 15 yards, right? So he was out there. But to me, the Cardinals are a team, and maybe this is a little bit of an example of where the Cardinals feel they are at right now. But they didn't play him a lot, along with, I doubt, and I don't think Kyler Murray played much at all either. But Marvin Harrison is someone that they really need to be productive this year in order for the Cardinals to be remotely relevant this year, right? Being in the NFC West, you obviously have your challenges. You have the Seahawks, who had a great year last year with Geno Smith at quarterback. They have a new quarterback, so things could change there. You have the 49ers, who had a down year compared to years prior. Brock Purdy's still there. They lost Deebo Samuel, but Christian McCaffrey should be healthier than he was last year. Brandon Ayuk, he's not going to be back until week 6, but everyone is still thinking that the 49ers are going to be a good team next year. You have the Rams, who I'll start to say this now. Like I'm already throwing the red flag here on this one, but a lot of people are projecting the Rams to be Super Bowl contenders this year with the addition of Devontae Adams and having Matt Stafford back there. And I've mentioned this in a prior episode, but I'm not buying that one. I'm concerned about Matt Stafford's back. Again, I don't think it's like a huge issue now. He's still not practicing, so it is actually it is an issue now. I don't think it's as big of a deal yet. But back injuries linger. Back injuries are something that can come back anytime, and that's a long season, right? 17 games is a lot of games to play, especially at Matt Stafford's age. And so I say all this to say Marvin Harrison and the Cardinals actually have a shot to be a little bit competitive this year, right? They could really actually surprise some people if they play to their potential, I think. And again, I'm not saying they're going to be a playoff team, but I think they could ruin some teams' opportunities to be a playoff team, right? That's the sort of level I put them at. I'll kind of compare that to, the Giants in the NFC East, right? I think they have that ability to be the disruptive team in the NFC West that could really ruin the hopes of some players. And so for me, the Cardinals aren't good enough to sit Marvin Harrison. They're not good enough to just keep him out long. Like he needs those reps. He needs those opportunities to get live reps with Kyler Murray out there. And so for me, that's a big aspect of this, right? Going into last year, again, he was drafted 4th overall. He had 62 receptions for 885 yards and 8 touchdowns. Now that's a good season. I'd say that's a really good rookie season, but I'd still think he didn't live up to his expectations. I'll go over a couple more wide receivers after this, and you'll see he wasn't even the top rookie receiver last year. And I'm not saying he had to be, but 885 yards, I bet you he's not happy about that. I don't think he went to his dad, was like, "Hey dad, like outplayed you." No, I don't think he was happy with it. And so I think that's a big aspect of this is, he needs those live reps, and you made yourself huge in this offseason. Like, let's use it, right? You should be a young, durable player. And so for me, I don't think Marvin Harrison is a guy that shouldn't be out there a lot. And so for me, I want to see him have more than one reception for 15 yards in a preseason game. The next receiver I'm going to talk about, and I already talked about his quarterback briefly, but it's Rome Odunze. Rome Odunze he again was out of Washington. He was the ninth pick overall last year for the Bears. And for me, again, this is a guy I will say didn't necessarily live up to his expectations. The Bears had a I would say, a pretty average pass game last year. Um, they did have Keenan Allen that helped out a lot for the Bears, and I would say was probably the main target for Caleb Williams. But they drafted Caleb Williams, and then very quickly after drafted Rome Odunze, and Rome Odunze had 54 receptions for 734 yards and 3 touchdowns. Again, not record-breaking, not earth-shattering or awe-dropping numbers from Rome Odunze. I think a lot of people expected more out of Rome last year, and he didn't necessarily have that production. And so, again, not a new quarterback, but a new coach, new system. Your quarterback didn't play in the first game. I certainly don't understand why Rome Odunze wasn't out there. Rome Odunze definitely, in my opinion, has not earned the right to not be playing in a preseason game. I was watching that game because I was excited and curious to see how Caleb and Rome would do. The only time I saw Rome Odunze was when he was in an interview. They were talking he was a sideline interview for like a lengthy period of time. He's wearing sunglasses, enjoying himself, acting like he's actually done something. Which to me, I don't understand that. If I'm a Bears fan, like I'm sure you're excited about Rome Odunze, but I'd also be mad at the same time. It's like, why is he not out there? What did Rome Odunze do to prove that he doesn't need to be in a preseason game? Right? What sort of mindset is that? I would love to hear more from Ben Johnson on that perspective. I don't think a lot of people understand why neither him or Caleb Williams were out there. Because to me, that is going to be your passing offense this year, right? Again, Keenan Allen went back to LA. He's with the Chargers now. And, you're expecting a lot out of Caleb Williams. And Rome Odunze is going to be a big part of that. I'm pulling up the depth chart now just to kind of see, because to me, again, Rome Odunze is definitely the guy. I know from a tight end perspective, it's Cole Kmet. They do have DJ Moore, who I think should have a really good season this year. He's someone that I don't think should be in preseason games. He only had 966 yards last year. But from a depth chart perspective, it's DJ Moore, it's Rome Odunze, it's rookie Luther Burden. Luther Burden was drafted this year. He was 39th pick overall, second rounder. He played a little bit in the preseason game. DJ Moore didn't. But then behind him, you have Miles Boykin, who I'm a Ravens fan, so I know who Miles Boykin is, but most people probably wouldn't. He was a second-round pick 7-8 years ago now out of Notre Dame, who never lived up to his potential. Wow, okay, this is even funnier. They have Devin Duvernay, another second-round pick by the Ravens. He's another backup for them. And then they have Olamide Zaccheaus, who I think is a good receiver, but he's not necessarily going to be a game changer for you. So you need to have Rome Odunze be a productive player. Like if Rome Odunze has less than 1,100 yards this season, I would say that is a disappointment. Not a major disappointment, but you were drafted that high. You're not playing in preseason games. To me, that's a message. Hey, we're set. I'm confident in what you're going to do this year. All right, let's see you get 1,100 yards, right? 1,000 yards used to be that metric. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Everyone's like, oh, can you be 1,000-yard receiver? That's not the metric anymore. You have an extra game. The players, teams pass the ball so much more. That number is, to be a top-tier receiver, you need to be catching the ball and running for 1,100 yards. And so, for me, again, I don't understand why Rome Odunze wasn't out there in preseason game 1. I would surely hope to see him out there in the second preseason game. If he's not, I'm going to be somewhat questioning Ben Johnson from that perspective. I heard one take, and I thought this was kind of interesting, one take was that maybe he's protecting them, right? Again, this is a new offense. We've talked about the fact that Caleb Williams has struggled to get comfortable in this new system. So maybe Rome Odunze is on the same page as Caleb Williams in that regard. Maybe they don't see what they want in order to put it into live reps on the field yet, just from a confidence perspective, right? I think Ben Johnson has mentioned this before. He's trying to protect Caleb Williams, and he's understood that Caleb Williams has lost a little bit of confidence, and so maybe Rome Odunze is on the same, in the same page from that perspective, and people aren't just talking about it enough because again, they're focusing on Caleb Williams. The next receiver I'm going to talk about, he had what I would consider a great rookie year, right? I'm talking about Brian Thomas Jr. Brian Thomas Jr. had a fantastic rookie season, in my opinion. He had over 1,200 yards and 10 touchdowns on 87 receptions. He almost had 1,300 yards. He had 1,282 yards. And if you know anything about the Jacksonville Jaguars, you'll know they had the worst passing game, the worst passing offense in the NFL last year, right? They paid Trevor Lawrence, but they still had the worst passing offense in the league last year. And so having a receiver, especially a rookie receiver, get almost 1,300 yards and 10 touchdowns is an anomaly. I don't think there is a single team that could say they had the worst passing offense and then have a receiver have that many yards ever. Again, I'll reference this again. I'm a Ravens fan, and we are known for having terrible receiving cores and having a terrible pass game most of the time. I'd say that's changed really the last 3 or 4 years, but historically, terrible. And the thing that we always tried to get was a wide receiver, again, to get 1,000 yards. Like, that would be an exciting benchmark for the Ravens and for a Ravens receiver. Brian Thomas Jr. out of LSU, he was a 23rd pick overall, right? He had almost 1,300 yards. That's crazy. That is so impressive. And so for me, the reason why I want to see more out of Brian Thomas is because of the fact that they were still so bad on offense that they need those reps. I know they paid Trevor Lawrence. I'm not expecting to see Trevor Lawrence out there anymore. Again, we kind of talked about, like, you at a certain point you've earned the right to not play in a lot of these games. Now, on this other side of that, you do see players like Patrick Mahomes out there. Patrick Mahomes had one pass for 1 yard for a touchdown, right? So he did play. And Joe Burrow played this year. I think I talked about this before, but Joe Burrow played purely because they have terrible starts to their seasons, like historically bad starts to their seasons. Ever since he's been on the Bengals, they always get hot at the end, but he always starts slow, and so that's why they're playing Joe Burrow right now. But for me, the Jaguars need to work on things. They need to have those live reps against other opponents live, not just their own defense. And so I do want to see more of Brian Thomas out there. I know a lot of Jags fans would be like, no, you're crazy. But again, at a certain point, you haven't earned the right yet. And I'm not saying Brian Thomas hasn't, but the offense hasn't, in my opinion. And so, again, I do want to see more of him this year in the preseason. If Brian Thomas has, if he even produces a little bit more this year, like, think about that, right? If Brian Thomas has somewhat of an increase in production this year, you're talking about a 1,400 yard season. That could mean the difference between the Jaguars being an early draft pick next year and potentially fighting for a playoff spot, because they're also in a pretty easy division, right? The AFC South is not that difficult. You have the Texans as the top team. And again, I already talked about the fact that CJ Stroud struggled last year to an extent. He still played pretty well, and they made the playoffs, but you have the Colts, who are trying to figure out who their starting quarterback is. One of the main competitors in that competition can't even stay healthy. Again, not always to his fault, but again, they're still trying to figure out who their quarterback is. You have a rookie quarterback in Cam Ward and the Tennessee Titans, who, besides Cam Ward, don't have anyone that's remotely exciting on that team, besides maybe, I guess you could say, Jeff Simmons on the defensive line. And, let's see what Calvin Ridley can do. Let's see if he can revamp his career. But again, the Jaguars have a chance to disrupt the playoffs. I'm not calling them a playoff team by any means, but I'll put them in the same category as the Cardinals and the Giants. The Jaguars could be a team that could ruin some teams' seasons this year. They have the weapons in order to do that, especially on the offensive side. And so, yeah, that's why I want to see more of Brian Thomas out there. The last player I'll mention from a wide receiver perspective, and this one's definitely a lot more understandable, but it's Malik Nabers, right? Malik Nabers, he's dealing with a little bit of a shoulder injury. He was in pregame warmups for the Giants, but he didn't end up playing in Saturday's preseason opener against the Bills. Malik Nabers, another fantastic rookie season. Only second to Brian Thomas, right? His former teammate at LSU. Malik Nabers was drafted 6th overall, and he had 109 receptions for 1,200 yards and 7 touchdowns. That's impressive numbers. He was 5th in the league in receptions and 7th in the league in yards. That's top 10 numbers in both categories. That's insanely impressive for a rookie wide receiver. Now, again, the reason why I'm talking about Malik Nabers and the reason why I want to see him out there more is because of the fact that, to me, this season, this game isn't about this isn't about Malik Nabers. For me, it's more so about him getting acclimated and getting comfortable with Russell Wilson for, in my opinion, the first 4 weeks. I think Russell Wilson will be the starter. But then after that, it's getting rapport and getting comfortable with Jackson Dart in live play. Again, there's a difference between practice in training camp and in live preseason games, right? Again, as a quarterback, you're much more likely to, you're not going to get hit, so you're much more likely to make risky throws and make throws that you probably wouldn't have made in a live game. And so Malik Nabers needs that live time with these quarterbacks to get comfortable with them. I'm not expecting him to play a lot, but at the same time, I would love to see him out there, and it looks like the Giants are attempting to get him out there more. So I will say that. But yeah, Malik Nabers, again, he's a type of player that if he has the same sort of production or improves a little bit, or even has a little bit of a down year, right? Let's say he gets 1,000 yards this season, still the same amount of touchdowns. Again, I said it before, Giants could be a team that could ruin the hopes of some other playoff teams, right? I'm not expecting them to be able to compete with Jaden Daniels and the Commanders. I'm not expecting him to be able to the Giants to compete with Jalen Hurts and the Eagles this year. So for me, their playoff hopes is almost near dead, but I do see them being a team that could ruin the hopes of other teams. That's the caliber of team I see the Giants as. I could see them being close to 500 if everything goes to plan, between what I've seen out of Jackson Dart. Abdul Carter has been playing out of his mind. I think he had 3 pass rush reps against the Buffalo Bills, but he made Deion Dawkins look less than average. He beat him 3 out of 3 times on his pass rush. He had 3 pressures on 3 rushes, and again, he put Deion Dawkins in a blender. And so the Giants could be a disruptive team this year, and so that's why I have Malik Nabers on this. Another guy that I want to see more from, and I think there's a caveat to this one just purely because I think it's because of the fact that their 3 main targets, their 3 main weapons, were only on the field in 1 game of the entire season last year. And I'm talking about Xavier Worthy of the Chiefs. Xavier Worthy, he had what I would consider to be a solid rookie season, 59 receptions, 638 yards, and 6 touchdowns, right? That's a pretty solid rookie season. Again, this is another first round pick, and he's a speedster, right? That's his gadget. You don't necessarily need to practice speed from that perspective, but at the same time, you didn't get a lot of time with all of these other receivers out there and with Patrick Mahomes, right? He did obviously play with Patrick Mahomes all last season, but having the entire core together, they haven't gotten a lot of live reps in that perspective. And so for me, that's just a simple reason why I need to see Xavier Worthy out there. Is I need to see this entire offense together as a whole. I'm not expecting it to be for an entire quarter, but preseason game 2 or game 3, I do expect to see at least 2 or 3 series with these 3 receivers out there, and I'm including like Hollywood Brown in that. Rashee Rice, I don't think we'll see out there. He's obviously still waiting to hear on what his suspension will be. It's most likely going to be at least 4 games from what I'm hearing. But again, they need those reps out there. Ricky Purcell. Ricky Purcell is another wide receiver that I want to talk about, and I need to see more from in the preseason. And there's a couple different reasons for this. One, and first and foremost, it's because of the fact that he didn't necessarily have the full rookie season that most of these other wide receivers got to experience. And a huge part of that is no fault to himself. He was involved in a freak accident where he was shot. I don't think he was the target of the actual bullet itself. He just happened to be an innocent bystander from what I understand. But Ricky Purcell started the season late last year. He only played in 11 games, right? So he missed the first 6 games of the season. He ended with 31 receptions for 400 yards and 3 touchdowns, which, again, that's pretty solid production for the amount of games you played. Now, what I will say is the fact that last year they didn't have CMC for a lot of this. They didn't have Brandon Ayuk for a lot of this, if not all of that. Brandon Ayuk, I believe, got injured before Ricky Purcell even touched the field for the 49ers. But they had an off year last year. They could not figure it out with the 49ers, and a lot of that had to do with injury, in fairness, right? Again, I talked about CMC not being out there, Christian McCaffrey. But Ricky Purcell, he was a first-round pick for San Francisco. He was 31st overall, so still a first-round investment. That's anytime you hear first round, that's an investment in a player. And so for me, I don't know what Ricky Purcell really accomplished last year that said to me, we don't need to see him out there, right? Again, 400 yards, 3 touchdowns, again, only in 11 games, but that is not enough to prove yourself, right? And to say you don't need to be playing in this preseason game. Again, maybe call me old school, but to me, if you have someone like Malik Neighbors trying to get out there and play, Ricky Purcell better be out there. And I understand a lot of this has to do with the coach's decision. It's not like Ricky Purcell is sitting there saying, hey, coach, I'm going to sit this one out. I understand this is a team decision, but I don't understand the logic of the team to not play someone like a Ricky Purcell. The one thought I have is the fact that they need to save him from an injury because Brandon Ayuk isn't going to be back until likely after week 6 is what I'm hearing. So you need to have a weapon like Ricky Purcell to be available. But again, you still need to work on that relationship with Brock Purdy. Again, you have the practices, but it's different. It is different in practice than it is in live reps. And so for me, Ricky Purcell should definitely be out there. The last wide receiver I'll get into, this is kind of a weird situation or interesting situation. I don't think it's weird, but Xavier Legette, right? Xavier Legette was the last pick in the first round last year, right? Carolina traded up in order to get Xavier Legette, who they were hoping to be their wide receiver one moving forward. He's a bigger bodied receiver, 6'3", 227. He had I would say a pretty decent rookie season. Again, nothing compared to what Brian Thomas or Malik Neighbors had, but he had 49 receptions, almost 500 yards. He had 497 yards and 4 touchdowns, right? That's a decent year, a solid year. He didn't have any injuries or I think he might have missed one game last year. I can't remember why, but he played most of the season. Um, I'm saying I need to see more of him out there. Xavier Legette did play in this preseason game, but he got ejected in the first quarter for getting in a fight with the safety of the Browns. I don't even think it was necessarily his fault. The amount of the fight that they showed, it looked like Xavier Legette was actually getting manhandled, and his head was just getting shoved to the ground while also getting dragged across the ground. And so he didn't get to have the performance or gameplay he was probably looking for in his first preseason game. But he got ejected, and so we didn't get to see him out there a lot. He didn't get a lot of those reps. And so because of that, receivers like Ted McMillan and even Adam Thielen was out there, right? It's an older receiver, and he was out there. And, their offense looked really good with them out there. They both produced. But Xavier Legette didn't necessarily get the reps and the time he needs. Because right now, I don't think the Panthers are looking at Xavier Legette as wide receiver one. I think Xavier Legette is now in the position of wide receiver two across from Ted McMillan. You also have Adam Thielen and then Jalen Coker. I think Jalen Coker and Thielen will probably be in the slot most of the time. And Xavier Legette and McMillan on the outsides. But you need to get more reps, right? You need to get better timing. You need to get more comfortable with working with Bryce Young, being on a different side of the field. I know that's not a huge difference, right? We're not talking about like a left tackle moving to right tackle or vice versa, but still it's a little bit different. And so for me, Xavier Legette has not earned the right to not play in these preseason games. Again, I know he was ejected, but he needs to be able to get out there, and I need to see more out of him in week 2 of the preseason. Next topic I'm going to get into, this is a really interesting one to me, and I think it's important to kind of talk about, give a little bit more of a backstory, because this did happen a while ago, and the human mind, right, our attention spans have gotten shorter and shorter, so I'll give a little bit more of a backstory before I really get into this. But I want to talk more about Jon Gruden and what's going on between him and the NFL. Specifically, Roger Goodell as well as ownership. So Jon Gruden has, in October 11th of 2021, Jon Gruden resigned from being head coach of the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, he resigned because there was reports of anti-gay and misogynistic language in emails that he was sending to NFL executives. Larry Allen comes to mind, who was then a vice president of the Washington Redskins at the time. But this story broke October 8th, and he resigned on October 11th, right? So this happened pretty quickly. There was a lot of backlash that Jon Gruden faced when this first came out, right? And understandably so, right? He said completely unacceptable things. He said things that no one should have to hear or listen to, from an outsider's perspective. Now, again, these were private emails, and that's really the premise of this entire situation and what I'm talking about today. So Jon Gruden won his appeal in the Supreme Court ruling. And the Supreme Court of Nevada ruled 5-2 in his favor, which essentially it blocked the NFL's ability to do an arbitration a closed door arbitration of this situation. Now, there's a couple reasons why this is important and why I want to talk about this. And before I do, just understand the reason why and the angle I'm coming from and what I'm most curious about and why I'm excited to see this be played out in a public setting is we're talking about billionaires that are trying to keep their dirty laundry hidden. Right? That's the biggest aspect of this. The reason why the NFL does these closed door arbitrations is because they don't want the facts to get out to the public. This happened, the same thing happened with the collusion case in regards to Russell Wilson, Kyler Murray, and Lamar Jackson that I talked about earlier this month, right? They had a closed door arbitration. Mike Florio got a hold of the transcript of that, and that's the only reason why people found out about what was going on with this collusion case. And the scariest part was the fact that the NFL and the NFLPA agreed to keep the findings of this collusion quiet because it looks bad. And so for me, Jon Gruden was fighting to say, no, we're going to put this out there and be public, right? His dirty laundry is already out there. They already clawed through his private emails, and everything he said was put out there for the public to see. The public judged him and already gave him his lashings, if you will. But he's now saying, hey guys, it's time for you guys to face that wrath as well. This wasn't just me. Now, to kind of go back a little bit on this again and why this is an interesting story and to kind of remind you of what was going on around the time. Jon Gruden wasn't the main target of this story to begin with. He wasn't the main target. He wasn't being investigated when these emails were leaked, right? I think that's an important aspect to point out. And that's why Jon Gruden is fighting this and why he won his appeal is because he's essentially saying, hey guys, you illegally leaked my emails. I didn't give you permission to leak these emails to the public. There was wrongdoing by the NFL, and I believe someone in the NFL did this, whether it was, someone in the Redskins organization, right? I could definitely see that happening, right? A lot of times people love to deflect and just kind of give people, the public, a squirrel moment, right? Everyone might be focusing on one thing, and next thing you know, it's a whole nother, like they're like, oh yeah, hey, no, focus on this, right? And that's what was going on because at the time, the Washington Redskins and Daniel Snyder and their workplace culture was being investigated at this point in time. That is the whole catalyst to this event happening. That's the whole catalyst to Jon Gruden getting fired or resigning, I should say, and these emails going out is because they were investigating the Redskins. Like I said, it was Larry Allen's emails that they found these emails in, who's an executive for the Redskins at the time. Now, the New York Times broke this, and you're wondering yourself, how did the New York Times get these emails? Well, that's what Jon Gruden is wondering. And again, he's already had his time in the public and getting in, people providing their feedback and providing their opinion on how bad of a person Jon Gruden is. Luckily for him, those opinions have faded. I don't think there's anyone talking about what Jon Gruden did in the past anymore. There was a long time where people were saying Jon Gruden is done in the NFL. I see more of Jon Gruden now than I ever did, right? And so he's made himself a little bit of a comeback. People have either forgiven or forgotten what he said and what happened. But now he's saying, hey, NFL, it's time for your time to shine. Let's put your dirty laundry out there. And no, I don't want to do this in a closed setting. I want everyone to know what happened here, and I'm not gonna hide it anymore because his dirty laundry's already out there, right? Everyone already knows about Jon Gruden's dirty laundry, and he's saying, hey, let's do this in the public. And so, for me, I'm sure there's been a lot of information that his team and his legal team has found in regards to what happened with this. I don't imagine a Supreme Court even at the state level, would just award someone an appeal if there wasn't some actual information, some factual information that could lead to Jon Gruden winning this appeal completely. So to me, there's going to be a lot more that I feel like is going to come out, and this still needs to be decided by a grand jury, right? That's a big aspect of this. This still might become and ruled in a closed door arbitration. So it's not actually fully confirmed that Jon Gruden is going to get what he wants, but he has won his appeal that says, hey, we are going to see this from a grand jury perspective, and it's not going to be in a closed door setting. So I think that's like really important to talk about because, again, the NFL doesn't like to talk about this stuff. They don't like their dirty laundry aired out. So I'm very curious to see what's going to happen from this. Are we going to hear more dirt about Jon Gruden, right? Are they going to throw another squirrel situation at us, right? Like, hey, pay attention to this. Jon Gruden bad, NFL good. The other important aspect to this, and I completely forgot to talk about this, and this is honestly the biggest reason why Jon Gruden doesn't want a closed-door arbitration. Do you know who is the arbitrator for the NFL when it comes to these sorts of issues? Who solves it? Who's the end-all, be-all deciding factor for the NFL when it comes to closed-doors arbitrations? It's Jon Gruden, the NFL commissioner. Who pays Jon Gruden? Who is Jon Gruden's boss? It's the NFL owners. It's that simple. It's such a whacked, like just corrupt sort of position. It's such a corrupt way of dealing with problems, right? Your cards are the deck is hedged against you in this situation when you are not an NFL owner. They have every advantage going for them when it comes to issues in the NFL because Roger Goodell gets paid by these owners. He is hired by these owners. That's who represents them in these situations. And he's the guy that's going to have to decide whether or not Jon Gruden was wrongfully dealt with and had his emails leaked illegally, most likely by an NFL executive, right? I don't think these emails were leaked by some random HR person for Washington. My guess is it's probably someone close to Daniel Snyder because Daniel Snyder was at the end of his rope in the NFL at this point, right? Daniel Snyder was the real target in this situation. I'm willing to bet a lot of money that Daniel Snyder was involved in the leaking of these emails. Maybe I'm sure it wasn't him specifically. He's probably not even efficient enough or technologically savvy enough to do that, but he's definitely grimy and slimy enough to do it. No one likes Daniel Snyder. He was a terrible owner. He was rated one of the worst owners in franchise history, right? Of all franchises in sports. I'm not talking about Redskins or Commanders or Washington football team wise, or even NFL wise. I'm talking about all of sports. Daniel Snyder was considered to be that bad of an owner, and this was the end of his rope, and I think he was desperate. And again, I think you're going to find out some things that the NFL owners don't want you to find out about if this becomes a public hearing. So I really wanted to talk about that really quick. I do appreciate all the comments, all the likes, all the views. Again, please make sure you subscribe to this channel. I'm on my road to 100 subscribers. All of them are appreciated. All of them are going to help me. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button. That's it for me today. That marks the end of the 10th episode of Bad Takes in Football. I'm your host, Bad Takes, signing out.